Acá está el inodoro que habla.
I love villain characters, and you probably do too. I mean, who doesn't? They're an interesting way to create conflict within a story by directly opposing the hero's actions and also getting in the way of that journey. Disney themselves are widely known for accumulating a rich library of memorable antagonists from a variety of different types. Just imagine the first thing that comes to mind when I say 101 Dalmatians. If you said Roger, you're dead-ass lying. But with over 60 movies now in the Disney canon alone, a decent selection of their other villains have and will remain sitting on the wayside, forgotten by Disney themselves and to a lesser extent animation fans. These are the villains who, from my experience as well as research, aren't as prominently featured by Disney or even talked about online compared to the likes of Ursula, Maleficent, Gaston, Lady Tremaine, Cruella, Hades, Jafar, you get the point. Now obviously I'm gonna set a few rules before we start. Firstly, no direct-to-video sequels. A majority of them are not considered to be canon, thank God, as well as the fact that they were produced by other studios and not the main animation division themselves. The reason I'm doing this may actually shock you. It's not because they're Disney sequels or anything, it's mostly down to how almost every villain in these movies are just plain forgettable. I'd have to make an entirely separate video on these characters if I wanted to actually mention every one of them, which would be insane, but mark my words, I may get to it someday. The second rule for this list is no TV villains. Again, too much to work with. I'm keeping this strictly down to both Disney and Pixar films. And the third reason? Okay, maybe there is no third reason. Either that or I can't be asked. Now let's do this already. Who the hell is this? If that was your reaction, I can't blame you. Bellwether is genuinely one of the most forgettable animated villains I've ever known, and for the longest time I couldn't even recall her name. Her plan essentially boils down to abusing a position as the assistant mayor to create a new order that places predator beneath prey. She's actually very good at executing this plan. She managed to obtain complete control of the city by hiring hitmen to target several unsuspecting predators throughout the districts. She even successfully framed Mayor Lionheart and got him arrested for a conspiracy he didn't participate in. The only problem with her is the twist, and you've probably heard this a million times already, but I think Bellwether's reveal scene is pretty lame. They waited until the last 15 minutes to reveal the true mastermind, and you can forget about clues as they only start giving out hints right before the scene itself. If I'm wrong, please tell me. It doesn't make her a terrible villain, but it also doesn't make her very good. Her plan is very elaborate and well thought out, which shouldn't be surprising given her high intellect. It's just how the film chooses to portray her throughout the film as this clumsy, super nice lady who would never do anyone harm, which turned out completely false. I get how the point of the mystery is to potentially mislead the audience through certain points in order to make them question who's really behind everything, but this movie quite literally pretends that Bellwether can never be that person. They make it either impossible for you to figure out or insanely obvious that it's her, just because, oh, she's a sheep, she's not a predator, so it must be her. I don't know, that take of mine was probably dumb. I may get cooked for it, but regardless, Bellwether remains one of the least brought up villains of the lineup, and one of the more infamous of the modern era. I still think she's better than the other two. Big Error 6? More like Big Error 6 out of 10, am I right? Okay, now being serious, Callaghan is an absolute fucking joke. Not only is he a very forgettable villain, but he's also widely remembered for his infamous twist scene.
Went in there to save you! That was his mistake!
It's been memed for a reason, and on top of that, Callaghan is absent for like half the film, and by the time he's reintroduced, he's a completely different person to when we first meet him. Are you sure these two are the same people? The movie doesn't bother handing out clues that could actually lead to the incoming twist, and instead completely forgets about him until the third act. This is not how you create a memorable villain, or character even. He wasn't really the most interesting person in the film to begin with, so why choose him to be the villain? His motive wasn't even good. The only reason he started doing any of this was because he lost his daughter for a portal malfunction, or so he thought. Yeah, it turns out she was still alive the whole time, so it kinda makes him look like a huge dumbass after everything. He really believed she was dead. Though to be fair, I can't blame him for getting mad at Cray. He knew the risks and still went ahead, a decision that almost cost Abigail's life and led to Callaghan's descent into madness, believing that he could get back at Cray by stealing the microbots so he could recreate the portal and take away everything that he loves. Yeah. But yeah, moving on. Well, well, if it isn't my old friend Sir Miles Axelrod and his little assistant. These two are some of the worst Pixar villains of all time, I don't care what anyone says. Looks like my opinions haven't changed one bit. In the case of Zundapp, I'd argue that he fits the role of a forgettable villain more than Axelrod, and it's funny because despite being infamously regarded as one of the worst Pixar characters, he still manages to escape everyone's minds. I hear at least 0 people mentioning this guy, even escapes from mine too. He's not Shan Yu levels of forgettable though, as I at least don't have to pull up a wiki page just for the basics. I can list a multitude of reasons for why Axelrod just didn't work, most of which come full circle during the big reveal, and in case you feel useless, just remember that he converted to electricity only to charge a conspiracy against alternate fuel by creating a company he can secretly sabotage so that everyone ditches eco-friendly fuel and return to using oil, allowing him to make money from it again. If that sounded complicated, I don't blame you. After all, this is the same guy who put his name on the bomb. Why would you fucking do that? As for Zundapp, he's mostly used as a decoy to distract those looking for the real mastermind, and thus he gets a bit more prominence on screen alongside his goons, although it doesn't stop the fact that he's a very forgettable villain. The Aristocats, a movie I saw once and said okay that was a movie and proceeded to never watch again. It was perfectly fine for what it is, but also kind of mundane, just like its villain. Edgar is a butler who works for Madame Montagne, and on the surface he appears to be a decent gentleman, but on the inside he is a greedy, impatient and scheming bastard, all because he overheard 2 people discuss inheritance money. Though to be fair, having a bunch of cats inherit the money before you would really suck. What would they even do with the money? I think for that reason alone, Edgar is one of the least bad in terms of overall villainy, but at the same time he's one of the dumbest villains of the entire roster. This guy would rather kidnap a family of cats and accidentally leave his belongings in the process instead of waiting a few years to inherit the money. And even if Madame Montagne did pass away and leave her fortune with the cats, Edgar would realistically be the one in charge of the finances, so in a way he'd still get the money. Motherfucker was so dumb that he couldn't analyze the situation for more than 5 seconds before immediately jumping to conclusions. Bro got deported to Africa because he beefed with cats. He definitely wasn't the brightest. It was also planned that Edgar was to pair up with a maid character who would have helped him with his schemes to get rid of the cats. Not much is known of her character, though she's about as memorable as Edgar himself. I've already talked about Rourke through my Atlantis video, which you should definitely check out after this one, but yeah, I may keep it a little brief here as there isn't much else I could say about the guy that I haven't already said. He's only here because Disney still generally ignores an overwhelming majority of their 2000s lineup, minus the occasion. That alone makes him an easy contender for Disney villains that aren't nearly as talked about. It's also worth noting that he was one of the earliest twist villains, a label that most people give to King Candy, but it's not like he's super obscure, as Atlantis lately has been seeing a surge in popularity, much like Treasure Planet, so attention towards him especially has increased. If anything, he's probably the most recognizable villain here. His plan throughout the movie is kept a secret from both the audience and the characters, until the 3rd act, with the occasional blink and you'll miss hints that you typically wouldn't catch the first time round. And yes, it was obvious, but unlike most of Disney's twist villains, this one I could actually buy. The twist felt believable enough for a guy like Rourke, and while his motivations boiled down to simply money and power, he at least had the appropriate screen time and charisma to keep you interested, and not to mention James Garner's voice fits him like a glove. He's also accompanied by Helga, who serves her role as the lieutenant closest to the commander himself. Again, I don't have anything new to say about her. If you want to hear my thoughts, check out my Atlantis video. Please. It's pretty ironic that I almost forgot this guy. I couldn't even recall his name. He almost didn't make the list for Disney villains that people forgot, and that's probably saying a lot. He's just not very memorable. And it's funny because I had an easier time recalling the film than the actual character. His overall plan was to convert every wildebeest into carnivores by sacrificing 2 lions to their god, who turns out to be Nigel himself. This movie was weird. The showdown between him and Samson, however, was pretty cool, and served to be his most memorable moment. It's also worth noting that he choreographed an entire dance ritual, specifically for worshipping a koala. I got nothing else. The Horned King is an interesting case. Conceptually, he's one of the coolest fucking villains of the entire lineup, but in execution, he's kinda lame. On the positive side, John Hurt delivers a great vocal performance, giving the character sinister tone and threatening presence, all of which are further elevated thanks to his character animation. Honestly, his character design just screams unbridled horror. Not that I'm scared of him, as that would be weird, but because of his rotting flesh and red eyes, I'd wet myself if he was real. But he doesn't really have much else going for him. He's barely seen throughout the film, which, okay, that's fine. He's not the main character anyway, which wouldn't be a problem if the movie wasn't so short. And the fact that his most memorable scene is his death really shows how unremarkable he kinda was. Again, it's weird because I like the Horned King, but even I admit he was underwhelming. I'm also in doubt whether he should be included at all, as much like Rourke, he's way more known in contrast to Edgar and Shan Yu, while at the same time rarely being acknowledged by Disney themselves, so he kinda counts? Oliver and Company is far from a well-known Disney film. When people discuss the 80s, they generally gloss over and bring attention to Roger Rabbit and The Little Mermaid instead, two movies often credited for kickstarting the Disney Renaissance in the following decade. It makes sense why people do this, as those two were much more successful and further impacted the animation industry on a wider scale than Oliver and Company. But despite its largely forgotten status, the movie is known to feature one of the most gruesome villain deaths of any Disney film. It's quite literally the only reason anyone would ever bring up Bill Sykes, the main villain of the story. I don't know much about his original counterpart, so I won't say much about him here, but what I do know is the Disney version, and honestly, I think he's pretty underrated. In contrast to most other Disney villains, Sykes is one of the few to resemble certain kinds of people who actually exist in the real world, or more specifically, loan sharks. These are people who prey on financially vulnerable individuals by charging excessive amounts of interest on those they lend money to. Those who've seen the movie will know that Bill Sykes fits this definition to a T. Throughout the film, we see him prey on a homeless man who owes a lot of money, and gives only 3 days for him to pay it all back. He's very ruthless and shows no remorse for his actions, and has no problem kidnapping a little girl for ransom. He would do anything to get his money, even if it means driving into a train. He also owns 2 dogs, Roscoe and DeSoto. They simply serve to be his little henchmen, and much like their owner, they too suffer a violent demise. Oh wow, I completely forgot about this guy. Goes to show how memorable this movie truly is. Okay, that's enough dunking. So you know when I called Professor Z one of the most forgettable Pixar villains ever created? Well, Thunderclap may just be number 1. I legitimately cannot name a single other Pixar villain at his level. I can't name a single memorable thing about this character, and I even rewatched the film to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And honestly, I doubt I missed anything in the first place. He's barely in the movie, so already I don't have much to work with. His introduction is almost 50 minutes in, and we only get a couple scenes from there. Again, not much to work with. His motives are very straightforward and not in a good way, obviously. He's a very boring character with a very unmemorable personality, and I am literally running out of things to say right now, so fuck it. It's funny because we're going from a boring dinosaur movie to another boring dinosaur movie, and best of all, they qualify for the list. With Dinosaur, I will say that it's at least interesting to think about, as it was Disney's technically first CG film. Sure, Chicken Little was the first to be fully 3D animated, but Dinosaur was the first to feature computer-generated characters in live-action backgrounds, and unlike The Good Dinosaur, the villain characters don't speak at all. What's interesting about Dinosaur is how it features multiple antagonists, rather than just one. Kron and Bruton are both shown to be antagonistic towards Aladar. The only reason I won't label them as villains is because of their ultimate goal to safely lead the herd to the nesting grounds, even if their actions seem misguided and wrong. They also share a common enemy, as the Carnotaurs' goals directly clash with theirs. It's also worth noting the Carnotaurs were carnivorous creatures in their time, and it's presented fairly well here. They spend a majority of the film tracking the herd, and are also responsible for separating Aladar from his parents before birth, connecting both the main villain and protagonist in some form. But overall, it's pretty easy to see why they're forgotten. You bring up Dinosaur to anyone and they'll just look at you blankly. It's not even included in the UK canon. If there is one way to describe Home on the Range, insane is probably the best word, just like its villain. As unremarkable the film may be, Alameda Slim is easily its most memorable aspect, and that's probably not a good thing. Rewatching the film has given me a bit of a weird perspective on the guy. In all honesty, I think his overall plan is actually not bad. His primary motivation for buying up all the land goes back to when he worked as a talented farmhand, but was repeatedly fired, possibly for his yodeling. Since then, he's been using his yodeling talent to round up all the cattle so he can sell them off for a large sum of cash, with the support of his 3 henchmen, who all look and act the same. Now, how exactly does he manage to attend these auctions? Ah, right. Actually, now that I think of it, Alameda Slim isn't entirely forgettable himself, and it's likely because of the very film he's attached to. Home on the Range was, and still is, very unpopular among the majority of animation fans, with some even blaming the film for completely tanking theatrical 2D animation, which isn't true. Plus, the film itself is just nothing special for most people. Most will not even remember the film at all. It's not as vigorously hated as Chicken Little, but it also isn't nearly as memorable. I guess releasing a 2D original film against the most anticipated animated sequel of the decade wasn't a great idea. Either way, Alameda Slim is a fine villain, just not very memorable. Wait a minute, I literally forgot about this guy, and I saw the film not too long ago. Maybe that's saying something. Rico for most of the film is a bounty hunter who is later revealed to be working for the villain this whole time. Best I can say is that he's really boring. I've already discussed this character a few times in the past, so I'll make it brief here. Madame Medusa is a treasure hunter who kidnaps an orphan for the sole purpose of grabbing her the Devil's Eye from a very small cave. She's very obsessive over the diamond and would do whatever it takes to get it in her hands. She's also very greedy, abusive, selfish and ill-tempered. She claims to be good with children but treats Penny like a tool and has no problem manipulating her into doing what she wants. She's not alone, however, as she's accompanied by an incompetent sidekick and 2 pet alligators. Her motivation for getting the Devil's Eye is predominantly fueled by her obsession for valuable treasure, with plans to sell the diamond after obtaining it. Yeah, I may be running out of things to say here. Madame Medusa is just sort of mid in my opinion. It doesn't help that the movie itself is kinda lackluster, because even the sequel was more notable, probably for technical reasons rather than story. And speaking of Down Under, this was inevitable. Again, I've already talked about this guy in the past, so I'm gonna have to keep it brief here. I don't want to repeat myself verbatim. Percival McLeach is a heartless poacher who captures all kinds of animals and sells them for profit. He sets his eyes on a rare eagle for the entire film, and is willing to do anything possible in hopes of capturing the eagle and doing God knows what to it. His personality is fairly distinct from Madame Medusa's, while also similar in some areas. McLeach is fairly tall and lanky in comparison, and also kidnaps a child in order to properly achieve his main goal. George C. Scott's vocal performance perfectly fits the character and matches the overall physical appearance of his. Again, like Madame Medusa, he's largely forgotten because of the movie he's in. The Rescuers Down Under is often excluded from discussions revolving around the Disney Renaissance period, and because of its measly financial performance, it's not as fondly remembered as some of the decade's lowest grossing films. A bit of a shame really. McLeach is honestly a pretty cool villain, and it would be nice to see him get more recognition. So yeah, those were the Disney villains that time forgot. I don't know how to end the video, leave me alone.